of West Indian and Black American descent. He is a Master of Public Policy student at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University, and the Boston Community Coordinator for the Autistic Self Advocacy Network. He holds a degree in sociology from Tufts University and has extensive experience with community advocacy, peer education, and activism, primarily in the disability and LGBTQ plus community rights sphere. His work is primarily focused on social inequality, the achievement gap, and working towards an intersectional view of disability rights. And here's Finn.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So, my presentation is Intersecting Selfhood, Trans Identity, Autism, and Mental Health Disability. So let's start with some definitions so we're all on the same page. So autism is a developmental disability that affects social interaction, sensory perception, and language. At least that's how it is for me. Cisgender describes people describes people who identify with the gender they were designated with at birth. Gender variant people are people whose gender identities or expressions are different from society's strict definitions of male and female. Non-binary people are people who don't identify as either male or female. People of color, or POC, or indigenous people are people who don't benefit from white supremacy in Western society. So examples would be Black, East, and South Asian people, or indigenous North Americans and Australians. And indigenous people were people whose ancestors were native to countries that were later settled by Indo-Europeans. And psychiatric or mental health disabilities, examples of those might be bipolar, depression, PTSD, borderline personality disorder, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, dissociative disorders, and then transgender or trans describes people who don't identify the gender that they were designated with at birth. So let's start by talking about gender identity and race. So it's hard enough being trans or gender variant if you're white, but it's compounded even more if you're a person of color or indigenous. Society's oppression is written on us, both as trans people and as people of color or indigenous people. We are constantly devalued because of how we came to know our gender and because of where our ancestors came from or looked like. When we come into our own by recognizing our gender identities, we are not just gendered people, we are also racialized people. For example, after I transitioned and started being perceived as male by the general public, things changed. I wasn't just being seen as a man, I was being seen as a Black man. While I benefit from male privilege in ways I didn't before I transitioned, this is tempered by this maleness being Black maleness. Women snatching their purses away from me on the bus. Having the cops called on me in a Walgreens in San Francisco because I was browsing the vitamin section and reading the labels while waiting to pick up a prescription. There was a deep-set, toxic cultural mythology that links Black men with violence, with criminality, with brutality, not with intelligence, sensitivity, or gentleness, or humanity, no matter what an individual person might be like. To be honest, I worry a lot about becoming the next Trayvon Martin, Oscar Grant, Philando Castile, Mike Brown, but with the added complication of being trans on top of that. Other Black trans men or masculine-presenting non-binary people might find themselves in my place, learning lessons that may not have learned before they transitioned. And not to mention, Black and Latina trans women are more likely to experience physical violence than are white trans women. That's not to say that white trans women don't experience discrimination or hostility, but those problems are magnified if you also experience racial oppression. These are the ways that gender identity and race can intersect. Next, we'll talk a little bit about gender identity and autism. Growing up autistic may impact how people perceive their own gender or how others perceive their gender. It took me a while to recognize my own gender identity. I was 11, and even longer to realize that I needed to transition for my own mental health, indeed my own survival. I was kind of a rule-bound person, so I thought I had to be a cis girl because that was the only information I was receiving from the adults around me, despite having some subconscious gender variance. It took me finding out about trans people later on. I think I was actually a Life magazine. It was this profile in Life magazine. It was like 11 years old, and I was talking about Christine Jorgensen, who was like one of the first out trans women in the U.S. After World War II. I thought, wow, so that's possible. So it took me finding out about that and other accounts to put a name to what I was feeling. I also didn't really feel I had the ability to really define myself outside what adults were saying I was, mostly because I had myself and identity pathologized from such a young age. There's so many of us who grow up with disabilities who are sort of indoctrinated in this cult of compliance. You know, if you don't comply, you're in big trouble. You know, you're gonna get points docked off your behavior chart. You're not gonna get stickers. You're not gonna get 5 goldfish crackers if you don't comply. You don't have quiet hands. You're in trouble. So it was hard, and I realized that I might be trans. When I realized that I might be trans as a kid, I continued to shelve it because I thought it would go away as I got older. It didn't. The dysphoria just got worse and worse, especially in my late teens and early 20s. It didn't help that I was surrounded by evangelical conservative culture, you know, hallelujah Jesus, that rewarded gender conformity. It probably also took longer because my maleness isn't macho or butch. And so some autistic people may not internalize gender and social roles in the same way that non-autistic people do. Some of us may not perceive things as being for boys or for girls in the way that others do. Of course, that's not the case for everyone. You know, I definitely bought into the restrictive gender roles from about the age of 4, about 10 or 11. I continued to, sort of enact those roles as I got older, but that didn't necessarily mean that I bought into them in the same way. Interestingly, it's actually been theorized that autistic people are more likely to be trans or gender variant than the general population. Now, that definitely matches what I've seen within my own social circle, but that doesn't mean, on the other hand, that people should treat an autistic person's gender identity as a symptom. Just because it's different doesn't mean that it should be treated as a pathology. It is, we have the right to self-determination. Let's talk about gender identity and mental health. So I've been diagnosed with depression and generalized anxiety disorder as an adult, but I struggled with them as a teenager too. I've experienced a lot of trauma that's contributed to these mental health disabilities, including bullying, verbal abuse, and teaching methods that were focused on suppressing my autistic presentation instead of being empathetic. So gender dysphoria, that feeling of not rightness and asynchrony about your body or how you're perceived by other people or your gender expression, can be really harmful to trans people's mental health. They can contribute to depression and anxiety. And the cure for gender dysphoria is not forcing us to live as the gender we were designated with when we were born. It's letting us live healthy, authentic, and self-defined lives. And of course, healthy can mean different things to different people. I don't think there's one true way to be healthy, and I don't think that the folks in this room think that either. Before I was able to transition, my depression and anxiety were much worse than they are now. I was barely able to leave the house for a while. Transitioning and getting treatment for the depression and anxiety was a godsend. I have anxiety and depression independent of my gender dysphoria, but treating much of the dysphoria made it possible for me to function. Before that, I couldn't function. It was a mess. It was a disaster. It was a huge disaster, but it was really bad. It's also important to mention that trans people's mental health might be hurt by toxic messages from society and the people around them who repeat those messages. Look at the kerfuffle over bathroom bills this year, and right-wing politicians like Governor Pat McCrory in North Carolina, and pundits demonizing us and acting as though we're the next coming of Satan. I've been estranged from my religious conservative Republican parents for 10 years because they believed that my gender identity was lies from Satan. They bombarded me with Bible verses and evangelical talking points. Literally, when I was 10 years ago, I was about 20 years old, and the topic of my mental health and, like independent living skills had come up. And the topic of me being trans came up. And the first thing I was told was Satan is a liar. Now, come on. Is that what you need to hear when you are struggling with depression? When you don't feel that it's worth getting up every morning? When you don't feel your life is worth living because you're forced to live in a gender role that doesn't match the way that you should be living? Is that what you need to hear? Of course not. These are the kinds of messages that society sends trans people when they live in hostile environments, when they see these politicians, these preachers going on and on and on about how being trans is evil. That is not what people should be about, but it's something that we keep hearing, and it's something we keep internalizing. As I said before, I have not spoken to my parents in 10 years, but their behavior has taken a toll on my mental health. I still have nightmares about them, like twice a week. The intersection between transgender and mental health issues is serious, and it is real. It's something that can't be dismissed. It's also something that shouldn't be used to invalidate our own identities. Just because we have mental health struggles does not mean that our gender identities are not real. In fact, as I said, the invalidation, the dehumanization, and the oppression can lead to mental health issues like anxiety and depression. I've lived with mental health issues for most of my life. And that doesn't mean that I don't have the right to determine how I should live. And that doesn't mean that other people do not have the right to determine how they should live. As a trauma survivor, as a trans person, as a queer person, I find that absolutely morally reprehensible. So let's talk about some of the takeaways from. So intersecting identities can make being trans or gender variant more complicated than it already is. And in order to foster acceptance for trans people in general, it is absolutely vital to look at intersecting issues like those of race or disability. These things don't happen in a vacuum. They're forms of interlocking oppression. They're forms of interlocking privileges, of experiences, of individual lives. And to treat trans identity as though it exists in a vacuum is to do our community a tremendous disservice. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. We have time to take some questions.
I don't even have a voice. I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for saying what so many of us need to hear. That our mental health, that our physical health, disabilities that we have, mental health disabilities, physical disabilities, do not negate our trans identities. That is something that I think, I know personally, I've been accused of making up my gender identity as a result of mental illness. And it's something that I think about every day when I put on my clothing, when I walk out the door or roll. Every day I think about the words that someone wrote to me about whether or not who I am is an illusion because of mental illness. And we, as a community, we're not talking about that. And I just thank you. Like,
No, I think that people's identities are what they are, whether or not they have a mental illness, and that it is like counterproductive and harmful to claim that we don't have valid identities. I mean, like there's people out there who have transitioned, who have found happiness and, you know, or at least like feeling more adjusted, who like have mental illnesses that affect their identity in other ways, like folks who, you know, might have DID or, you know, something else that, you know, contributes. And I know plenty of folks who are both, you know, on the DID spectrum and have transitioned. Or like folks with like borderline personality disorder, et cetera, who have transitioned and it's still benefited them. You know, even like disabilities like schizophrenia, you can't just say, oh, they're crazy, they can't transit. Like, no.
Any other questions or comments for Lynn?
Thank the speaker for looking at himself as a whole and bringing together the different parts that comprise that whole. I think in this conference, we're seeing that it's not just one corner or another corner, but we're all in it together. And I happen to have mental disabilities, but that isn't making me separate from the disabilities here. Thank you.
No problem.
First, I want to thank you for your presentation. And I really appreciate your information. I'm curious if there's any research being done to follow up on this information with trans identity or queer identity. And I wonder if that kind of
There's been some on the intersections between trans identity and autism. I'd have to look at stuff for other disabilities though.
I wonder if you are starting to do that kind of research. I think you would find many people around in the community who would support you in that.
If I have the time to do so, and if I can get support while I'm going through grad school.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lynn.